I mean, I'm back. That's some bullshit. Absolute bullshit. My VS Code install is corrupt. I don't even know what the fuck that means. What does that even means? More information. How did I didn't do anything. How did I break it? I mean, it's been working fine for me, so I don't know what's going on with it. I'm not switching to Vim. Fuck that shit too. I don't know. I can't even fucking close that damn thing. I'm not gonna fuck with it. It's been working just fine. I'm not gonna make changes to it. I'm gonna leave it how it is. Wow. I'm busy anyways. Where's my fucking... The fuck? Get out of here. Go back to this.
This is how the function should be called eventually, and that this ID should be provided to the function we get on this select topic key. And if we now save that and reload, this is our application, and we can still pick and select the different topics. So now this works without passing props through multiple components and without emitting our custom event through multiple components. It's simply a different approach. So we learned about provide inject in the last lectures, and it is a very powerful tool built into Vue. It's very useful for letting components communicate. It's important for you to keep in mind that you can only communicate between parent and child components or child components of other child components, so that you can't use it to communicate between neighbors or anything like that, as I explained and showed over the last lectures. But here's also one other important thing. You should not always use provide inject to replace props and custom events. Indeed, props and custom events should be your default communication mechanism. You might consider using provide inject though, if you find yourself having some pass-through components as we had it here. Knowledge base was just a component passing through props and passing through the emitted event. In such cases, using provide inject can save you some unnecessary code and can make your code base a bit leaner. You could also argue that it makes your code a bit harder to understand though, because if I look at this code, I see that I got two provided values here in app.vue, but then I have to dig into all the components to understand where those values are being used. This is absolutely doable in this app, since it's not a complex app, but it is something that can be cumbersome in bigger apps. So use it wisely. And if you have a lot of pass-through components, definitely use it. If you have just one pass-through component, you might still be fine with using props and custom events, even though you have some redundant code though. But that is up to you and ultimately comes down to your personal preferences. With provide inject and props and custom events, you got all the core tools though which you need to let components communicate with each other.
Alright, well this fucking module is gonna kick my ass.
So that's it for this component communication module. Again, another big module with a lot of important concepts taught, but in the end, really just a couple of core concepts which you need to keep in mind to let your components talk to each other. Now, in general, components are used to build user interfaces by combining them. The great thing about components is that you can encapsulate logic in a template and split your code into multiple smaller pieces, and that you can also reuse components, for example, components that encapsulate list items. Components then form parent-child relations automatically. If you use component B in the template of component A, then component A is a parent of component B, which would be the child in this case. And if you have a component C in the template of component B, C is a child of B and also kind of a child to component A. That is what I talked about throughout this module and what you saw in action as well. And this matters because when we talk about component communication, you need to keep in mind that Vue uses unidirectional data flows for communication. So basically that we have ways of passing data down to a component or also up from a component using a different concept. Well, and these are the concepts. For passing data down, we have props. This allows us to pass data from a parent to a child. So props are used for just that, and we should define props in advance in that child component which will receive them. You can either just specify an array to let Vue know about the props you want to receive, or you go into greater detail and you also let Vue know which type of data you're expecting, whether a prop is required, and all of that. You saw that in great detail throughout this module as well. If you need the other direction, so from child to parent, you need custom events. A component can emit a custom event with help of the built-in $emit method to let a parent component know about something and to trigger code or trigger a method in the parent component. Custom events also can carry data, as you saw throughout this module, so that you, for example, can forward data the user entered into some input fields, the ID of something which was selected, or whichever data you need in your use case. So we have parent-child and child-parent communication. What we don't have here is neighbor communication. So if we have two sibling elements. And I talked about this throughout the module as well. If you have a scenario where two neighbor components need to exchange data, you will in the end always use the common parent component of these two sibling components, store the data in there, and then talk to that parent from each sibling and pass the data down to the respective sibling components that need the data. So you always have parent-child in the end. You don't have sibling communication or anything like that. Sometimes you have the scenario that you have a lot of components in the way through which you need to pass your data or your custom event. And for that, you got this provide inject pattern, which I showed you at the end of this module. If your data needs to travel through a lot of components, which basically just pass that data through with help of props or custom events, then you might want to consider provide inject. That allows you to provide data in a parent component and then inject it into any child component, no matter how deeply nested it is, without passing the data through multiple levels of components with props or custom events. Now, as I mentioned, don't use provide inject to replace all your props or custom events with it. Instead, really only use it if you need this long-range communication, you could say. And that really is all you need to know about component communication at this point. Make sure you understood the concepts taught in this module. And with that, let's advance and let's dig deeper into Vue and into components.
I don't understand that shit. I'll come back to it. But I want to keep going through the course.
We now know that components can be very useful. We know how to build them, how to make them reusable. Also, with the help of props and custom events, we learn how to combine components and start building user interfaces with them. In this module, we're going to dig a bit deeper. We're going to dive deeper into components to unlock their full potential and to turn you into a component and therefore, most importantly, Vue master. Now, specifically, we're going to have a look at component registration and styling. Of course, we already know how to register components with our Vue app, but it turns out that there is more than one way of doing that, and that every way has its purpose and could be the right way of doing it under certain circumstances. We're also going to have a look at how we can style components and make sure that certain styling only affects certain components. We're then also going to explore a concept called slots, what that is and why it is useful, and we're going to explore dynamic components and where dynamic components could help us. And last but not least, we're going to have a look at component names and possible folder structures we can use in our projects, especially if our projects are getting bigger and we want to make sure that we are quickly able to find all our different files. So with that, let's not waste any time and let's dive right in.
Let's do it, dude.
I got another starting project for you, which you'll find attached to this lecture, of course. In there, run npm install, once you downloaded it, to install all the dependencies. And then with npm run serve, like always, you can bring up that development server and see this application on the screen. And here is what you should see on the screen once you load that. It's a very basic dummy application. It has no real purpose, and it also has no interactivity. We can't do anything on this page as a user, but it allows me to dive deeper into components and show you some other core features. And we're then going to build a complete application from scratch, and a more realistic application, of course, in the next module, once we covered those important features we're going to talk about in this module. So let's dive into those features, and let me quickly walk you through this dummy application here so that we're all on the same page. In main.js, I'm importing and registering a couple of components, the components you find here. In app.vue, I'm using the header component, this batch
So we
list.
see how here,
You find here.
how he, oh, you fucker. How he registered these? I haven't done this at all yet in my Vue projects at all. So I don't know why this is being done this way.
The components you find here. In app.vue, I'm using the header component, this badge list component, and also the user info component. To user info, we're passing some data via props. The data here is coming from inside the data object we have in our app.vue file, so in this configuration for our main app. And then in the components, in user info, I'm getting those props, and then I'm just outputting them here. I'm using the base badge component here, and I'm passing more props to that. The base badge component also just has some basic markup. It's responsible for displaying these badges here, admin and author, which you can see on the screen. And in the base badge component, I just got a computed property for deriving this dynamic CSS class object, which is bound to the class attribute here. And I also got some styling. Actually, I got some styling in a couple of those components. The badge list component just shows all available badges in an unordered list. So here we're using the base badge again. So we're not just using base badge in the user info, but also in the badge list component. And the header component is a very simple component where I just render and style the header we're seeing on this page. So let's now see what we can learn about components, which we haven't learned already.
So what I'm seeing is that he breaks almost every single element inside of like a container or div down into a different component and then puts them all together inside that div. So I guess I need to start doing.
Let's start with component registration. We are registering our components with the component method on our app. And that's how we did it in all the past modules. Now, there is nothing wrong with this approach per se, but it's also not always the best way of registering components, because it turns out there is an alternative. Now, when we register components like this with the component method on our app, then we are registering those components as so-called global components. That means they're available globally in this entire Vue app. So we can use these components as custom HTML elements anywhere in this app, in the app.vue file, but also in any of our components here. So they're simply available anywhere in this root app. This is, of course, very useful because it means we can use these components as custom elements anywhere, and we don't have to think about where to use them. But it also has one potential downside. These components, of course, all contain some code. Now, of course, here, they're all fairly simple components, but still, it's a little bit of template code, a little bit of scripting code. Now, this code, of course, grows the bigger our application becomes. The more components we have, the more code packages we have, you could say. And if you're registering them all globally, that in the end means Vue needs to load them all when the application is loaded initially. So the browser needs to download the code for all those components initially. This is absolutely no problem for our basic application here, but for bigger applications, it could be a problem. In addition, if you register everything globally here, this can be a very long list. If you have an application with, let's say, hundreds of components, this would be a super long list, and it would not be obvious where those components are getting used. If all these components are meant to be used in multiple places, or if maybe some of these components are only used in a few places. For example, the header. This component is really only used once. It's used here in app.vue. The same for user info. These are components which are just getting used once, and registering them globally therefore works, but is a bit redundant, you could say. We're just having these components so that we can outsource our code and keep our app.vue file lean, because that's the idea behind components. We want to build complex user interfaces by combining multiple building blocks. And that's why we also have another way of registering components. Despite registering them globally with this component method on our app, we can also register them locally in the component where we plan on using them. So for example, with the header, we could remove this component registration in main.js and remove this import here, and instead go to our app.vue file, which is where we plan on using this. And then here in the script section, we can import the header from components, the header.vue. And now we can also register this component locally in this app component, or in this app object here, in this app options object. We do this by adding a new property here next to data, methods, computed, and all the other properties you learn about. And that would be the components property, which we haven't seen before, but here it is. And we can now tell Vue which components may be used in the template of this app here, or of this component. And the components registered here are then really only usable here, not in any other child components, not anywhere else in our application, just here in this file, in this .vue file. Now, components wants an object, and then we need a key value pair, where the key is our custom HTML element, so the header, for example, the tag we want to use for this element, so to say, and then the value is the imported component config object we're pointing at. And if I do that and save this, this still all works, but now the header is registered locally. And you can actually also write this differently. This is perfectly fine, but you can also use the header like this as a key here, as a property name, and you will still be able to use it like this in your template. Vue automatically translates this so that you can use that dash header in your template, or in case you prefer it, the header like this. And then you can also write it as a self-closing element if you want to. This self-closing tag is not supported if you write it with a dash in between. Then this self-closing tag will not work. If you write it in this Pascal case, it works. So this is then up to you which style you prefer. I will stick to the header because that's the style I've been using before, but you could now also use this Pascal case style. When you register it like this, both is possible. And then you can shorten this even more. You can remove this key here and just pass the header like this, because there is a modern JavaScript syntax feature, which is supported in this project setup, where if you just provide a single value here in an object, this is automatically expanded to this syntax, so that simply key and value variable or value constant have the same name. So you can then just write the header, and this will register the header component under the header identifier, and you can then use that dash header like this, or as I explained before, use this Pascal case if you prefer that. That, if we save that, would also work. So this is how you can write your components and use your components, and this is local component registration. And of course, here in this demo application, the header is not the only component we can register locally. If we have a look, the user info is also a component we simply use here in our app template. The badge list would be another candidate. We also only use that here in our app.vue file. So we can actually grab the imports to user info and badge list from main.js and cut them there, and remove these global component registrations and only leave the base badge here, and then go to app.vue and add those imports here, and then add badge list and user info as local components in the components option here. And this code should still work because I didn't change those names here. Now, this components option is available in any config object, not just in app.vue. You could also register local components in one of your other components if you had local components that would belong there. But in this app, that's not the case. We're now left with the base badge component, which I'm still configuring
I'm comfortable with
globally.
this. I understand.
And this is a component I want to keep as a global component because I'm actually using it in multiple parts of this app. I'm using it in the badge list component and also in the user info component. And whenever you have a general purpose component, which you're using in a lot of different places, whenever that's the case, you typically want to use a global component. At least you want to consider it. Of course, you could also add it as a local component to multiple other components, if that makes more sense, but using a global component also often is correct in such cases. On the other hand, if you do have components which you only use in one other component, let's say, then you might want to consider registering them as local components, simply to keep your main JS file short and to not register everything globally. With that, we got this working, but now we know global and local registration and when to use what. We're going to stick to this global-local theme. Let's talk about styling. We know how to add dynamic styling and so on, but I don't want to talk about this. I want to talk about component styling. You know that you can add this style tag to your .vue files, and in here you can set up some styling. Now, maybe you remember that earlier in the course, I mentioned that no matter where you added your styling, it would always be treated as global styling that affects the entire app. So if I define a section h2 style here in the badge list.vue file, this does not, important, this does not mean that this styling would only affect this template. Instead, indeed, it affects all files. And I can show this to you. In the header.vue file, I'm selecting the header element by its tag, and I'm applying a certain style here. Now, in user info, I'm wrapping this h3 tag in my base badge with a div, and actually using a header element here makes more sense semantically, in my opinion. But if I switch to a header here, you will see that now I got the header styling being applied here in my user info component as well. And that, of course, breaks my style there. Now, this is happening because I do have my header styling set up in header.vue, and as I explained, even though it's set up in that file, it affects the entire app. Sometimes this is what you want. For example, in app.vue, you typically do define your global application-wide styles, like setting the body or some font family. So styles that should affect everything in your app typically are defined in the style tags of your app.vue file, since this is your entry point of the entire application. But if you have styles in individual components, it often would be nice if you could scope these styles to those components to ensure that they really only affect the template of the component in which you defined them. And Vue supports this. There is a scoped attribute which you can add to that style tag. And if you do add it, that tells Vue that the styles defined in here should only affect the template that lives in the same file, and no other component, no child component, no sibling component, nothing else in your app. And we can do this in all those components, therefore. So in the header, I add scoped. In user info, I just added it. In base badge, I'm going to add it here. And in badge list, I'm also going to add it to make all those styles scoped. And if we do that, you see now we no longer have this style, this header style being applied here. We also see that some styles broke because I relied on this global sharing, but I actually rather fixed those broken styles than having this side effect of being restricted which element I can use where, or of being forced that I have to ensure manually that styles don't spill over and destroy my layout. So therefore here, in user info, I'm simply targeting the section header here to fix the styling in my user info header. And regarding the available badges here in badge list, the problem is that the section lost its styling, because I did define that styling here in user info, well, I'm simply going to copy that over to badge list, add it there, save everything, and it's back. So that's scoped styling, a super useful feature to make sure that your styles really only affect the component in which you're defining it. Now, in case you're wondering how Vue actually implements this, if you inspect this with your developer tools in the browser, you will notice that Vue achieves this by giving your elements special attributes, like this data-v-something attribute. Now, this is added by Vue, and you see in the styling, actually Vue changes your selector behind the scenes, like this header selector here, to actually now be header plus this generated attribute. And since every component's template will receive its own attribute, this ensures that styling is scoped to that component's template markup. That's how Vue implements this behind the scenes, with this custom attribute and by adjusting your selectors.
Slots. I am kind of familiar with this, but I have no idea.
There is another cool feature when it comes to Vue components, which, once you know it, will give you way more options of structuring your code and splitting your code into multiple components. And that would be the feature of slots. Now, what are slots about? Let me show you an example. In user info, we have this section with a header and a paragraph. In badge list, we also have a section with some content. Now, the content is different, but there is one important thing which both components, badge list and user info, have in common. And that's the section, but actually not just the section, but the section and the styling that's being applied to that section. You might remember, in the last lecture, I copied the styling to ensure that the section has the same style in both components. Now, of course, an alternative would have been to simply make section a global style, here in app Vue, where the style is not scoped. But another alternative would be to create a standalone component which simply contains the section with the attached styling, and which then is flexible regarding the content it receives. That could be something like a base card component. Now, the name is up to you, but I'm naming it like this because I want to create a certain look, which is sometimes referred to as a card look in the web. Basically, this look of having a drop shadow and rounded corners, this is often referred to as a card look. And I'm going to create a component here which encapsulates that look, so that we can easily reuse it wherever we want. And for that here, in this template, I will add a section like this, or maybe also just use a div to make it a bit more reusable semantically, but that's just a minor thing, it doesn't really matter here. And then I add my styling. And important, I'm going to scope this styling by adding the scoped attribute. Now I'm going to copy over this section styling here to my base card, and change it from section to div, of course, because I'm now having a div here. And now I want to make sure that the content in here can be anything we want. I basically just want to use this component as a wrapper with a certain style attached. Now, how could we receive content from outside now, though? Well, we learned about props, right? We can add a script here, like this, and then simply export our default JavaScript object, and now accept some props here. But what would be our props? Would it be content, and we then try to output content like this? That actually will not work, because if we now want to use our card here, we can't pass in our HTML content with all those Vue features we're using. Let me show you what the problem is. Let's say we register this globally, because we're going to use this card in multiple places. So here in main.js, we're going to register it like this. And then here, with the app component, we have our base card, like that. And now in user info, I want to use it. So I want to, in the end, wrap my content here with base card, like this. I'm not replacing the section with it, but I put my base card into it, and I'm wrapping this content with base card. This is, however, not how props work, do they? If I save that, I now lost all the content, because Vue doesn't know where to render this. I added it between the tags of a custom component, and, well, how would Vue know what to do with that, where to output it? After all, our custom component has its own template. Yes, it has a content prop, but, well, Vue doesn't know what's in there. Now, we could, of course, set content here equal to a string and pass this content here as a string to content, but then this would no longer be able to use Vue features. So that's all not the solution. Instead, it's this slots feature which I mentioned. Vue has a special syntax for this exact scenario where you want to use your own component as a wrapper around dynamic content, so around different kinds of HTML content. And for that, you simply go to your component that should be the wrapper. You don't use props in there, but instead you use a special element, the slot element, like this. And if you now save that, you will see this works, and we got the look we want. And if I go to user info, please keep in mind that I deleted the section styling here. So this look is really coming from our card component. And that's how slots work. They allow us to receive HTML content, which also may be using Vue features, from outside of the component. Basically just like props, but where props are meant to be used for data, which a component needs, slots are meant to be used for HTML code, for the template code a component needs. So here, we now just provide a shell with some styling. We could also add some logic if this component needed to, but we then allow the parent component to provide the HTML code that should be inside of that div. And that's the core idea behind slots.
That's pretty fucking neat, I'm not gonna lie.
So now that we learned about slots, we can of course use our base card slot also here in the batch list. There I also got a section which should have this card look. So we can remove this section styling here, not the h2 styling, I want to keep that exclusive to this component, but the section styling. And then use our base card component here to wrap this unordered list and the h2 tag in our case. So use base card as a wrapper around this content, and that will now ensure that again it looks like before, but now we have this reusable card component, and we can use it wherever we need that look. But that's not even all you can use slots for. It is nice that we're able to pass dynamic content between the opening and closing tags of our own component. But sometimes you also have the scenario that your custom component should have multiple slots. And actually I can show this here at the example of this base card. At the moment it has one slot, but it would not be unrealistic that it should have two slots. Let's say one slot for the header and one slot for the main content. So here in base card, we could add a header component to ensure that we always have the same structure for every card, for example. And then here, we also want to add a slot, like this. But of course, now we have two slots, and therefore, Vue wouldn't really know where the provided content should go. So that's why, if you use more than one slot, you can add names to slots with the name attribute on the slot element. And here we could give this a name of header, but that name is up to you. Can be anything. Doesn't have to be the wrapping element's name. You don't have to name all slots. If you leave one unnamed slot, that will be the default slot, but you must only have one unnamed slot. And now you can assign the content to the different slots. For example, in user info, we could now go to our header here, and now here I want to tell Vue that this content, the h3 tag and the base tag, should go to the header slot. And for that you wrap it with a template tag, which is a default HTML element, and on that template tag, which holds the content that should go into your name slot, you add a special directive. The Vue Slot Directive. The Vue Slot Directive can be used to let Vue know where certain content should go to. Now you let Vue know where the content should go to by adding an argument to this directive, which you do by adding a colon and then the name of your slot. Now I have a name slot with a name of header here, and therefore we can add header as an argument here. And this tells Vue that the content inside of the template will go to this name slot. Now as a side note, the template is a default HTML tag, which doesn't render anything to the screen though, which is why we use it as a container here. Now, if you then have content left, which is not in a template with vSlot, that content will automatically go to the default slot. So if I save that, it looks almost like before, but we can tell that something changed because now the label, the badge here, is no longer next to the name. And it is no longer next to the name because we no longer have the header here in user info. Instead, we have the template where we send this content into the header of base card. And since the header styling, which was responsible for placing the badge next to the title, is still in user info and is scoped to this component, it does not affect the header in base card. We're going to take care about styling in the next lecture though. Before we do that, however, let me go to badge list, and here I want to send this h2 tag into the header. So again, we need a template, wrap h2 with it, and then add vslot header. You can also be more explicit about the fact that this here, the rest will go into the default slot by adding a template here. Adding a template around that, and then adding vslot default. Default is a reserved name, and like the name implies, it always targets the default slot. So I'm going to do this here, and also in the user info component to be very clear about which content goes where, and to make it obvious that I did not forget to assign this to any slot, but that I want this to go to the default slot. So that's why I add this default slot template to both user info and badge list here. But with that, that's what we got. Now let's explore the styling here, and let's see how we can fix this when working with slots.
Okay, that's pretty fucking neat, I'm not gonna lie. I had no idea how all that shit worked.
Slots are a powerful feature, but now we broke the styling. We broke the styling of our user info component here, where the badge should be next to the title, because we previously targeted this header here to apply our styling. Now, we're sending this content into a header, but into a header of a different component, of the base card component. Now, you could think that the content that's sent into a header is defined in the component where this styling is scoped to, and therefore the component it's being sent to, the base card component, should be affected by this styling as well. But that's not how Vue works. There's a very simple rule. When working with slots, and when sending content into other components' slots, nothing changes about what you learned regarding scoped styles, availability of data and props, and so on. For example, full name this prop here, which we have available in user info, is also still only available here in user info. It's not available in base card, even though we are sending this markup to base card. But Vue.js will analyze, compile, and evaluate this template before it sends the content to the other component, so to say. So therefore, here we have access to whatever is defined inside of user info, and the styling defined here also affects this markup, but not the markup of any component we might be sending our content to. That's how this works. And that's why this header style here does not affect the header in base card. So if we want to affect this header, of course, what we should do is grab this selector, remove it in user info, and therefore, since we have no styles left, remove the entire style tag, and go to base card instead. And then there, in the scope styling there, we can add the header styling. And with that, we got the look from before, because now we moved the styling to the appropriate place.
That's fucking neat. I like that.
So slots clearly are an important feature. They give us way more flexibility and allow us to do things which we can't really do or which we can't really build without slots. Now, I'm not done with slots though. There is more we can cover about them. For example, you can provide default slot content. So with that, I don't mean that you have a default, an unnamed slot, where content will go that doesn't target a different name, but I mean that if you have a slot which receives no content, that this slot can then render some default content. For example, here in the header, we can add default content by adding content between our slot tags here. Let's say a h2 tag here, where I say that default, just to show how this works. It doesn't make a lot of sense for this specific component, but you definitely can have components where some default content might make sense. Now, if you add such an element, if you add content between your slot tags, by default, this will not be visible right now, because all the places where I use the base card do provide content for the header slot. Both the badge list as well as the user info component both provide content for the header. But let's say the badge list wouldn't have its vslot header template here, so it doesn't provide any content for the header slot. If you remove that, you see now the default in that component, because now the slot fallback content, the default content of that slot, is being shown. And that, of course, can be useful for certain components. Now, we can argue if it's useful for this specific component, though. Why should a card, which should just act as a wrapper that gives us some visual styling, why should that have a default title? After all, you don't know what the content that will be passed into the card will be about. So rendering some default title probably does make a lot of sense. I'll still leave it here for reference, but of course it is just an example. But you can, in such cases, where you don't know if you really need that slot element here, you can also use another nice feature. If we wouldn't render this default fallback content, our badge list card doesn't have any title. But if we inspect the HTML markup, we of course see it has an empty header element. And whilst we don't see that on the screen, this is not ideal semantically. Having an empty HTML element lying around in the DOM, I don't know, I don't want to have that. You can utilize another cool feature here. In the component where you define slots, you get a special property provided by Vue. We can see it if I add the mounted lifecycle here. Let's then console log this $slots. $slots is another built-in property provided by Vue, and it holds information about the slot data this component receives for its different slots. So if I save that, open the developer tool, and there the JavaScript console, and reload, we see 2 console logs here. Why do we see 2? Because we're using our component that has slots twice. We're using it in user info, and we're using it in badge list. So every time this component is getting used, mounted is getting called, because this base card component gets created and mounted twice, obviously, since we use it twice, and therefore we get this console log twice. Now, the interesting thing is, in those objects, we have access to the different slots we're providing. So we can actually access .header here, because we have a slot named header here. We could also access .default, because we have a default slot. Now, if I access .header, we'll see something interesting. If I reload again, we also see 2 outputs in the end, this one, and we see 2 outputs for the same reason as explained before. But the interesting thing is that we see this strange output here once, but that we see undefined the other time. Now, undefined here is coming from the usage of this base card component in the badge list component. There, we're not providing content for the header slot, and therefore in base card component, when I try to access this provided content, so to say, I get undefined when this base card component gets created for the badge list.
And
now that's something we can utilize here. On this header element, we could add the if and check if slots header is truthy. So if it's undefined, it will be falsy, and therefore this header element will not be rendered. So if I now save that and reload, we get the same log. But if I inspect this badge list component, you now see the header is gone. And that's just, of course, a minor improvement. It's also definitely a bit more advanced, but I hope you understand what we're doing here. With $sign slots, we can check whether we do receive data for a specific slot, and if we don't, we could use that information to not render a certain element. The header still works fine in the user info component. There, the base card outputs the header, because there, for the usage of base card in user info, we do provide content for the header. It's just the usage in batch list, where we also use base card, where we don't provide header content, where therefore we remove the header. We could use this $slots information. And now there's one additional thing about slots which I also want to mention. In the places where you use the component that offers slots, so in our case in batch list and user info, we do provide slot content with this template and the vSlot directive. Just as for vbind and vOn, there is a shorthand for vSlot. You can absolutely write it like this, but you can also replace it with a hash symbol. So hash header also means the same as vSlot:header. And that's simply a bit shorter. We can do the same here for the default slot, and of course we can also do the same in the batch list and target the default like that. So we can write this in a bit of a shorter way, and with that we get the same output as before, we get no error, everything works, but now we're using this shorthand here.
Nice. Nice, nice.
Now slots are an important feature, and as you can tell by now, also a quite powerful feature, and you can do a lot of things with them in Vue, as you can tell. Now there's one last thing about slots which I also want to mention here. It's definitely advanced, but it is worth knowing about it. For that, I'm going to create a new component, courseGoals.view, and I'm going to add a template here. And in that template, I want to output a list. And for the moment, I'll not care too much about the styling and so on. I just want to focus on this slots feature, which I want to show to you. So I have an unordered list, and I have a script here defining my config object for this component. And in there, let's say we have some data. And we have some goals in here, which of course could be dynamic, but for the moment, I'll just define them like this. Simple strings like finish the course and learn Vue. So definitely nothing too fancy here. Now, of course, we can render list items here with v4 by looping through our goals as you learned it. We can also add that key and set that to our goal, for example, so to that string, assuming that every string is unique in this array. And then, of course, we can output our goal here. And now we could go to app.vue, for example. There, import this newly created component. So import course goals from /components course goals.vue, and thereafter register it as a local component so that we can then use it in the template here. So let's do that. And I will simply add it here, course goals, like this. So now I added my component here, and hence we see the goals here. And as I mentioned, the styling is off, but that's not the focus here. Now, what does this have to do with slots? Sometimes, if you're building a component which you might want to share with other people, with other colleagues, or which gets used in different ways in a bigger project, you want to make certain aspects of that component customizable. For example, here, we could have this component which has the course goal data, which maybe also has more logic related to that, and which then takes care about rendering those course goals to the screen. But there's one thing which you might want to make customizable, and that is the content of every list item. With that, I mean, if you just have the text in the list item, if you maybe have a h2 tag in there, maybe multiple elements, so maybe you want to make that customizable, so that this course goals component could be used in different parts of the app, but the content of the list item could be different every time it is getting used. Now for that, we could of course think about using a slot here, right? We could enter a slot here, and if we have a slot here, the content, the HTML markup, which is passed to a list item, can be defined from inside the place where course goals gets used. And that sounds exactly like what I'm trying to do here. So in AppView, where I'm using course goal, I could now pass in my content for course goals. And I could say that I want to have my goal text inside of a h2 tag here. But that's now where the problems start. Yes, I can pass in my markup, but I have a big problem. I don't have access to the individual goal for which this list item is getting rendered. This goal variable is only available here inside of course goals. But the markup, which should be output in here, is getting passed in from app.vue here. And here I don't have access to this goals or goal variables, which I'm using in course goals. And for this specific scenario, where you want to build something like that, Vue has another feature. It has scoped slots. Now, what are scoped slots about?
Jesus fucking Christ.
The concept of scoped slots is about letting you pass data from inside the component where you define the slot to the component where you pass the markup for the slot. And you do that by going to the component where you have the data and where you define the slot. And then on the slot, you can add a prop. For example, goal. This name is up to you. And you can also bind it with vbind or with the shorthand to a dynamic value, in my case here to goal. And to avoid naming confusion here, I'll name this item, though you could absolutely also use goal. That would be okay, but to make it clearer, I'll name my prop item here and pass this goal, which is created for every iteration, to item. Now these names are up to you, but whatever you set as props on slot, so on this slot element, will now be accessible in the place where you pass data for that slot. In this case here in app.vue, where I'm passing this markup for my slot. And here we can now get access to that data by adding a template around our slot markup, so around the markup which we want to pass into that slot. And on that template we use vSlot or the shorthand for the default slot in this case, but the same concept would apply to named slots, of course. And now here, we can define any name of our choice, like slot props. But this name is also up to you. This simply is the name of a variable which you can define, which Vue will give you. And this variable, the value you get for this variable, so the value you get for slot props in this case, will always be an object where all the props you define here on slot are merged in. So if you had another prop here with some data, that would also be part of slot props of this object, accessible under the another prop key. And I'll actually leave that here for demo purposes. Here it's not bound, it's just set to a string. So now here we got this slot props thing. What can we do with it? Well, you can now use that inside of this template. For example, here to interpolate between the h2 tags and now access slot props dot item. Dot item because I added an item prop here on my slot. If you chose a different name here instead of item, it's a different name here as well. And below that, I'll also add a paragraph where I output slot props. And now here using this square bracket notation so that I can access a property with a dash inside of it, and then referring to another prop, which I defined here. Important, here, Vue will not convert this automatically to a camel case notation. So if you have another prop with a dash here in course goals, you need to access it with exactly the same name here in the place where you define the markup, and that's why I need that square bracket notation here, because with the dot notation, this would be invalid JavaScript code. With the square bracket notation, this works. So now with that, if we save that, we see our output here, including the dots from the another prop, which I defined for demo purposes. And this hopefully makes it clear how scoped slots work. It's definitely a niche and advanced feature. You will not need it all the time, but there are specific scenarios where it is impossible to build what you want to build if this feature wouldn't exist. And that's of course why I'm covering it here as well. But be aware that it's definitely a niche feature. Now there's one simplification which we can make here, by the way. If you're only targeting one slot, only the default slot here, you can remove that template here. And let me first of all cut this, remove this unnecessary template wrapper, and instead add this hash default slot props thing directly on your component tag. This is only allowed if the markup between your opening and closing tags here should entirely go into just one slot, into the default slot here. Then you can use this simplified code here. As you can see, it works. And then this is the shortest way of writing this in the end. And that's now really it for slots and also for scoped slots. I know it's a lot. We'll see it in action throughout this course in various projects. And the scoped slots feature, as mentioned, is also a very advanced and niche feature.
Holy fuck me.
Time to finally leave slots. In app view, I'm going to remove all those components I've been using thus far, except for the header, because I now want to clean up the UI. I will leave the files here, though, for reference. But now let me quickly create two brand new components here, which have nothing to do with this dummy code we used before. Let's say we have a manage goals.vue file and an active goals.vue file. Manage goals could be a component where the user is able to add new course goals, and active goals is a component where all added and active goals are displayed. We're not going to add all the logic for that, though, because I want to show you something else. Therefore, I'll keep it simple and just say active goals here in the template of the active goals component so that we can recognize this component. And in manage goals, I'm going to add a template where I say manage goals. I'll not even add script tags here. I'll not export a default config object, because if it is empty, you don't even need to export it. It will, so to say, be exported and created for you automatically behind the scenes. You then don't need to define it if it is empty anyways. So you can have components with just templates like here, and now we can add them as local components in app view. I'll import active goals from components active goals.vue, of course, and import manage goals from /components manage goals.vue, like this. And then register both as local components here in this case, active goals and manage goals. And now, of course, that shouldn't be a surprise, we can use them here. Active goals can be used like this, and manage goals can also be used like this. And now my build process here is complaining about the fact that I have components registered which I'm not using. So let me actually remove batch list user info and course goals from here, and also comment out those imports then here. So now this rebuilds. And now we can see active goals and manage goals on the screen. Now that's certainly not too exciting, but here's the cool feature I want to show you. Vue has this concept of dynamic components, and here's where this could be handy. Let's say we're building a component that has various tabs, so various buttons in the end, which we can press to show a different component, so that we either see active goals or manage goals, but not both at the same time. For that, we could have our tab buttons here, active goals, and then another button where I say manage goals. So I have these two buttons, like tabs here. And when I press a button, the respective component should be shown and the other component shouldn't. Now here's how we could implement this. We can manage some extra data here, selected component, for example, and initially let's say that is active goals. So the HTML tag name, which we are also using here in the DOM, active goals. And then we add a method here. So we add the methods key, and in there add a method set selected component, where I get the component as an argument, and then set this selected component equal to the value I'm getting here as an argument. And now we can bind this method here to the buttons. So here, upon a click, I want to call set selected component and pass in active-goals. And on the manage goals button, upon a click, I will call set selected component and pass in manage-goals as a value for the parameter. So these are now the buttons. And now that we can change the selected component, we can add VIF here on these two component tags and check if selected component is equal to active goals here, or here on the second component, if selected component is equal to manage goals. And if I now save that, we can use this like tabs, and we can switch between these components. But that's nothing new. Here, we're only using features you already learned about. Now, whilst you can build it like this, if you have more and more components between which you want to cycle, using VIF all the time and repeating that VIF code all the time is pretty annoying. That's why Vue has an alternative way of doing that. So let's comment out this here, and let me introduce dynamic components to you. Vue offers you a special HTML element which you can use, the component element. This is an element, a component, provided by Vue. And the interesting thing is that this component won't work like this standalone. It doesn't show anything on the screen. Instead, it needs one key property, and that's the is property. The is property tells component which component of all the components you defined should be shown in place of this component. So for example, we could set this to active goals. But of course, we don't want to hard code this, because if we did, we could just use active goals like that, if we would always show just that component. Instead, what we want to do here is we want to bind is dynamically with vbind, or with the shorthand, and then in this case point at selected component, which holds our component HTML tags as values. It's active goals initially, and in our method here, in the end, we switch between active goals and manage goals, which are our component tags. And with that, we're telling Vue that component should basically swap itself for either active goals or manage goals, whatever is currently stored in selected component.
That's pretty fucking
cool. So with that, if I reload, I got the same behavior as before, but now with less code, without multiple VIF statements, which of course makes our life as a developer easier and means that we have less code to write.
That's fucking neat. Pretty happy about that.
Dynamic components are definitely an interesting feature, which can help you add certain features to your apps in an easier way. But here is an additional thing you should know about dynamic components. Let's say in manage goals, we had an input field. Let's actually say we have a wrapping div here, like this. And then in here, we also have an input field where the user is able to enter some goal name. Now, this is just a dummy input field. We're not doing anything with its value here, but it would be realistic that we have one component or multiple components where the user is able to enter something, and that we then load this component dynamically with component. Now, here's the problem we'll face with that. In manage goals, we have the input field. But if I enter a goal here, and then before I save it, I decide to go back to active goals, and then I come back to manage goals, you see what I entered is lost. And the reason for that is that when we switch our components, the old component is really destroyed and removed from the DOM. And that, of course, means that anything we entered here into this input field is lost if we switch away, because the input field is removed from the DOM. And when we go back to manage goals, a brand new input field is added again. Now, this is maybe not what you want, and Vue has a solution for that as well. It has another built-in component, the keep-alive component. And you can wrap that around your dynamic component. So keep alive works together with this component, with this dynamic component concept. And it does what the name implies. Keep alive allows you to tell Vue that components should not be removed and deleted entirely, but that instead their state should be saved, that they should be cached behind the scenes. So with keep alive added here, if we go back and reload, if I enter some goal here, and I go back to active goals, and then back to manage goals, this text is still here. Because behind the scenes it was not entirely deleted, but Vue kept all the information around, ensuring that we're not losing this content here. And it depends on what you're building, whether you want keep alive or not, but it's good to know that it exists. Are you ready for more Vue component features? We're slowly getting to an end of this module though, promised. And you already know a lot of the core features you gotta know. But here's another nice feature which sometimes can be very nice to have. Let me stick to this manage goals component, even though it's not super beautiful. And let's say here we have a button. Where I have a text of set goal. And when this button is clicked, I want to save my goal. So for that, I'm going to add a script here in manage goals and add a method. And I'll keep it very simple here. I'll name this goal, this method set goal. And in here, I then want to check what's inside of the input. And if it's empty, I want to show an error message to the user. If it's a valid goal, we'll not do anything here because I want to focus on that error part and on the error message. So here we point at set goal. And inside of set goal, we can get our entered value with help of refs, for example, or with vModel and two-way binding. But here I'll bring back that ref concept, add my ref key to the input element, and give it an identifier of my choice, in this case goal. And then here with $refs.goal, we can get access to this input element, and therefore with .value, we can get the value the user entered. And now if entered value is an empty string, let's say, then I want to show an error. Now here in the browser, we can use the alert function for that. Input must not be empty. That's a message we could output here, and the alert function is available in the browser like that. So if we now save that and go back, here in Manage Goals, we now have a button, and if I enter nothing here and I press Set Goal, I get my alert here. This works, but in most applications, you probably don't want to show an alert like this. This built-in alert is not really nice to look at. It probably doesn't fit the styling of the rest of your application, and therefore, this is maybe not what you want to do. Instead, maybe you want to build your own alert, your own modal, so your own overlay dialog, which you want to show. And that's exactly what I'll do here. I'll build my error alert.view component here, and that will be a very simple component which uses the built-in dialog element, which is a default HTML element, to output some content. And actually here, we could use some slot content to be flexible regarding what's shown in that dialog. Now I will add some scoped styling here real quick, targeting this dialog, giving it a position of fixed top 20 VH to move it 20% down from the top of the window.
This is Maximilian Schwarzmüller's
30% here,
Vue
like this,
course.
And give it a width of, let's say, 40%, so that we have a centered dialog here in the end, and give it a background color of white and a box shadow to have a light drop shadow here in the end. But that's just some basic styling. I'll also add a padding of 1 rem, and that's it for now. You can definitely style this in a more beautiful way, but that should do the trick for now. So now we have this dialog where the exact content inside of it is flexible, thanks to our slot here. So now in Manage Goals, I want to show that dialog if the user entered something invalid. How could we do that? Well, we could use vif for that. We could manage some data here in our Manage Goals component and have an input is invalid data property, which initially is false, because initially the input is not invalid. After all, the user hasn't entered anything yet. But we'll set this to true here if we see that what the user entered is invalid. So we can then set this input is invalid to true. And now we want to show our error alert here if input is invalid is true. So for that here in this template, we could simply add error alert, this component. And in order to use it here, of course, here we should import error alert from ./error_alert.view. Not ./components, but just ./error alert.view, because it's in the same folder as Manage Goals, which is where I'm adding this import. And then we can register this as a local component here. It's the first time we're registering a local component outside of app.view, but as I mentioned earlier, this is absolutely possible. So error alert is now a local component here in Manage Goals. And now I only want to output error alert if, with vif, if input is invalid is true. And then in here we could have a title, for example, input is invalid, and a paragraph where we provide more information. Please enter at least a few characters. Anything like that. This here is the markup that will be provided for the slot in error alert. So with that, we should hopefully show an error alert if the user enters something invalid. So if the user enters nothing. Then, thanks to this data property and vif, we show this error alert. Let's give it a try. Let's save that, reload, go to Manage Goals, and enter nothing. Click Set Goal, and we see nothing. That's my bad, though. The built-in dialog element needs an open attribute to be displayed. Therefore, we could, of course, also display the visibility of this dialog by toggling the open attribute, but I will always add open, and instead just show or hide it by adding or removing the entire component to the DOM with vif. But make sure you have that open attribute on the dialog, otherwise it won't work. And with that, if I reload and try to submit an empty goal, and this is our error dialog. Now, it looks like the styling was messed up a bit, and we can fix that by adding a margin of 0 here. If we do that, we should have that centered dialog. But it's not so much about the styling anyways. I mean, that can still be improved. But we see that we can now open our custom overlay like this. And of course, we could tweak it in more detail, but this is already a useful pattern to be aware of. We can also make it closable now by going to Manage Goals, where we do pass our markup to this component. And for example, there we could add a button, OK, which we can press to handle this error. And upon a click on this button here inside of Manage Goals, we can trigger another method, confirm error could be the name, where we simply set input is invalid back to false to give the user another chance. So confirm error is now triggered upon a click on this button. This is also showing you, as a side note, why the concept of slots is so powerful. We can add the content for a totally different component in the component where we have all the logic for showing the error alert component. So we don't need to pass data around with custom events, which the error alert emits here. Instead, we can handle everything here in the component where the error is generated, and yet hand off the styling and the markup of that dialog to a totally different component, which is a really nice way of splitting responsibility, if you want to look at it like that. But with that, if I now reload again, and I confirm an empty goal, we now also got the button to close this dialog. And that's very useful. But this, again, is nothing new. It's just a nice pattern to see, which is also not bad, but this is not showing any new feature. Well, we're going to dive into a new feature next, because our current implementation has a slight problem.
Uh-oh, we're going to be teleporting elements. Yikes.
So what's wrong with our current error dialog here?
Hold on. I'm going to take a quick intermission break really quick. I have to use the bathroom, and I will be right back. Oh god, that's fucking loud. I'll be right back. Here be. Alrighty. Well, let's get back into it. Pause that, hop back into
if
this.
I open it,
go back to
visually, everything is all right. But if I inspect this here, we can see a problem in the HTML markup. Here's our dialog, right? It's below the button input and the h2 tag. And it's below there because that's where we added it in the template of manage goals. Now, visually, as I said, everything works, but semantically, and from HTML perspective, having this element, the dialog, which actually is treated as an overlay to the entire page, having that nested here in our HTML code is not ideal. It works, but for accessibility, this could be strange. You could also run into some styling bugs here, and it might simply make more sense if that dialog wouldn't be down there, but if instead, let's say, it would be somewhere here. It would be inserted at the root of our HTML tree, and not deeply nested inside of it. Really just for semantic and also partly accessibility reasons. And this is something which is easy to achieve with Vue and a feature called Teleport. Teleport is a built-in Vue component, just like component and keep alive. You can wrap your to-be teleported thing, so your to-be rendered somewhere else thing, in this case the error alert, with that built-in teleport element, which again is a built-in component Vue provides to you. Now, how does teleport work, or what do you do with it? Teleport wants one prop, one attribute, the to prop. And here you provide a CSS selector selecting an HTML element on your entire page where this content should actually be added to in the HTML markup. So logically, it still belongs to this component. You can still interact with methods in that component and so on. But it will be rendered somewhere else in the DOM structure. And here, for example, we could select the body element by just referring to the body tag. You could also refer to an element by ID selector like this. You just pass in a regular CSS selector here. And here I'll go for the body tag, which means please render the content of this component, the actual HTML markup that should be added to the DOM, please render it in the body element,
Did my
directly in the body element,
stream
and
die
not
again?
deeply nested in this HTML structure as it was happening before.
No? Okay, we're good.
So if I save that and reload and generate this dialog, it looks like before. But if we inspect this now, we see this dialog is now at the end of the body section, and it's no longer deeply nested in this div and any other elements. And semantically, this can be better. It's of course a small optimization. It might not matter to you, and you don't have to use teleport if you don't want to, but as you can tell, it's super easy to use. And it may help you with the overall HTML structure and ensure that you don't just create an application that looks nice and works correctly, but that it also uses a semantically correct HTML structure under the hood. And teleport makes that easy, as you can tell.
Pretty fucking neat.
There's another feature or aspect about components you should be aware of. In some components, like the header here, we have only one root HTML element, like the header element here, and all other elements, in this case the only other element, h1, are child elements of that. In other components, like manage goals on the other hand, we theoretically have multiple top-level HTML elements, at least if I remove that div here. And it is important to be aware of the fact that this is okay. And I'm highlighting this because in Vue 2, this was actually not supported. In Vue JS version 2, you were required to have one root level element per template, and then in there you could have as many sibling elements as you wanted to. In Vue 3, this changed, and now you can have as many top level elements as you want. So
Ooh,
if you
that's
don't need
nice.
a wrapping element for semantic or styling reasons, there is no reason to keep one around. This is a feature called fragments. You are allowed to have multiple top level elements now.
Nice. Yo, what's up, Unicorn Dev? How you doing, buddy? Welcome back, dude.
Hi, friends.
Now let's move away from code for now, and let's talk about our folder structure and our file names here. You probably just followed along and named your files.
Good to see you, my friend.
But the question is, why did I choose the names I did choose? And is this the most optimal folder structure? There is an official Vue style guide. On the Vue website, you can find it under Docs Style Guide. And here you will get recommendations on how your code should look like, how you should name certain things. There are essential rules, which you basically have to follow, and then there are various levels of recommendations, like strongly recommended rules you might want to consider following, and then just generally recommended ones. Now, you can read through that to get an idea for how you should name things. For example, in there, you learn that components should be stored in files, so one component per file. You learn that you have base components, like the card, which you might use in different places, which you then should name base button base card, and so on, or app button app card, whatever you prefer here. You'll learn about single instance component names, like our header here, which I named the header, following the style guide here, where it's recommended that if you have a component which is only getting used once in the entire app, the name should be the, and then something that describes the component. Now, throughout the course, I will follow this style guide as good as possible. I will also say, though, that from time to time I might deviate to explain something in a better way, or to have an... And you can go through it as well to get some ideas on how you want to name your things and which kind of code you want to write when you work with Vue on your own. Be aware, though, that these are not technical rules, but really just recommendations. So if you don't want to follow a certain rule, that is fine. It's your project. You don't have to adhere to those rules, especially if you're working on your own. If you are working in a bigger project with a team, or if you are planning to share your code with others, though, you should consider following this guide so that everyone is basically working with the same rules in mind on the code base. And that's all I want to say about the style guide at this point, because this is a course where I want to teach you Vue and where I want to focus on Vue, the framework, and the features it offers. And as I mentioned, I will follow this style guide anyways, so by just following along with the lectures and this course, you will automatically get a feeling for how to name things, how to write code, and how to write good code.
Nice, nice. Exciting.
Now, the style guide is one thing. It helps you write good code, it helps you name your files. But there's another aspect that you should keep in mind if you're working on bigger projects. And that is related to how you organize your files. Thus far, we have the source folder, and in there we have a components folder with all our Vue components. This is a typical structure, and there's nothing wrong with it, but in bigger projects, this of course will reach certain limits. If you have a project with hundreds of components, having them all in one folder can be very hard to manage. You might have a hard time finding the components you're looking for. Therefore, you might want to consider creating subfolders. For example, we could create a subfolder named base or UI for all those base components, like the card here. So I'm moving the base card there, I'm moving the base badge here. Of course, when you do that, you want to make sure that you update all the imports you're using. So in main.js, I'm now importing base badge from components/UI base badge, and the same for the base card. Otherwise, Vue will not be able to find these things and your project will break. Now that's the folder for the general base components. We could also create a subfolder inside of the components folder named layout, where we place things like the header or the footer if you have one. So therefore, of course, make sure you also update the import here in app.vue in our case. And then you might have various other components which you might want to organize by feature. If you're building an online shop application, for example, you could have a subfolder named cart, where you have all the cart-related components. You could have a subfolder named checkout for the checkout-related components, one named products for the components that are dealing with outputting products, and so on. Now here, I have various demo components, because this here in the end isn't a real app which we're building, and therefore I will just leave them here. But in the next module, we're going to use everything we learned about components over the last modules, and we're going to build a full application from scratch. And there you will see a proper folder structure in place to manage all the components, because there we'll then have a real application where this makes more sense. For now, just be aware of the fact that you might need to restructure your folders here at some point to keep your code manageable.
I'm excited.
That was another long module about components. But with that, we're done with components. We now know all the core features you need to know. And in the next module, we are going to practice all the features we learned in this and the previous modules by building a complete project, a complete app. Now, in this module, we had a look at component registration and styles. And you learned that components can be registered globally or locally. Globally with the app component method, locally by importing them and adding them to the components option in the config object of a component or app. You should prefer local registration for most components, but if you have components which you are using in a lot of different places of your app, then of course global registration makes a lot of sense. We also had a look at styling, and styling can also be global or scoped. Global styles affect all HTML elements, no matter in which component they are, and scoped styles only affect the HTML elements in the template of the component where you are using them.
Every time Unicorn Dev comes in here, I'm like, shit, he's gonna tell me I'm fucking some shit up, and all I think about in my head is
no, don't do it. No, don't do it. No, don't do it. I'm a virgin. No.
Every fucking time. Oh my fuck, dude. And that's what I think, and then he's over here like this.
I know words, I have the best words, but there's no better word than stupid.
He just fucking, I know he's fucking thinking that shit as well. Oh my fuck, dude. I kill myself sometimes.
You should prefer scoped styles for most components, but definitely set up global application-wide styles, like a font family, in an unscoped style tag in your app.vue file. We also had a look at slots, another key feature. Slots can, in the end, be used as a placeholder for dynamic HTML code, which can then be inserted from outside into a component. You can have single slots, you can have multiple slots, where you then also need names.
Yo, so my mind has been fucking blown. Like, I thought I was, like, really understanding a lot of the nuts and bolts of Vue, and then now going through this updated course from Maximilian, I didn't know fucking shit. Like, I had no information, like none, no info.
Nothing.
Like,
I got nothing. I don't get fucking any information. Nothing.
I had fucking nothing in my brain, dude. It's bad. My mind is fucking blown.
Only one slot may stay unnamed. You can provide default content for slots, which will be used as a fallback if no content is provided for that slot from outside. And we learned about scoped slots for some advanced use cases. Slots are another key feature which unlock wrapper components like cards or dialogues, and you will see them in action again in the next module. We also have dynamic components. Dynamic components is a feature built into Vue, unlocked with the built-in component. This can be used to dynamically swap it for different components you defined, and you can also control the caching of the component with the built-in keep alive component, as you learned it in this module. We will also use this feature in the next course module, so in the project we're going to build there. Now, last but not least, we had a look at teleport and the official style guide. teleport is another built-in component which can be used to manipulate the DOM structure and control where something is added to the real DOM whilst keeping your component hierarchy. So that.
What are you saying there? What is this breadstick shit? Oh my god.
You gonna nail me? Huh? Are you gonna fucking nail me?
Oof. That's all I think about.
That will not be changed by teleport. And last but not least, I introduced you to the official style guide, and you might want to consider following that, or at least have a look at it to keep your code clean and understandable. And that's it for this module. In the next module, we're going to practice what we learned here, and
I'm excited. What are you fucking doing? Oh my god. Jesus fucking Christ, man. Jesus.
Shoot your gilmite, dude.
Yikes.
Fuck this shit, I'm out. Fuck this shit, I'm out. No thanks, don't mind me. I'ma just grab my stuff and leave. Excuse me, please. Fuck this shit, I'm out. Nope. Fuck this shit, I'm out. Alright then. I don't know what the fuck just happened, but I don't really care. I'ma get the fuck up out of here. Fuck this shit, I'm out.
Where's it coming from? Buttons that I have down here. Dude, I did so much work. That's why I haven't been here for the last fucking 9-10 days. Like, why I haven't been streaming. I completely just revamped my entire fucking life, man. I want to start taking this way more seriously. Yeah, I just have all this shit downloaded and put them on fucking different hotkeys. Like, I completely just redid my whole fucking everything, stream-wise. Like, just completely changed everything. I don't know if you've seen my new improved setup at all, but I'm pretty happy with it. Pretty fucking easy peasy. I have a lot more to still work on. I'm not sure how I feel about this theme I got going on right now. Could be used, but I wanted things to be a little more professional, I suppose. I'm gonna eventually somehow. I actually have another monitor to add into that, and this I only have 2 actually. It's just a case over there behind me. Let me see if I can do this really quick though. Ah, cool, it fucking works. Copy this, copy. Here, add, new, browser source here. There we go, add source here. Yep, Cool. So this one is my streaming computer, and this one is my gaming computer, and this one is just an empty case. So, gaming, streaming. And then I set all that shit up. I have a lot more shit to put on the wall still. My soundboards are right. Fucking quality, dude. That 4K video quality, it's nuts. It's on my phone, by the way. I set my phone up as a an IP webcam transmitting over my 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi band to my router that I can connect to it on my phone. I mean, on my computers, which is pretty fucking neat because I might just use this shit as a webcam, to be honest, because it's really fucking nice. Like, really fucking nice. I don't know. Fuck this shit, I'm out. Get rid of that shit really quick. Okay. So, we're about to hop into this, Hoggies, exactly. I'll hop into this project here, and hopefully, it's nice. It's legit. It's legit. Actually, really quick. Start this bitch back up really quick. I think that I can set up the video renderer, so I can set it up and have it render with Flash, the browser, Java, or JavaScript. And I can like change a whole bunch of shit. Like the zoom level over here, the stream quality, can have it autofocus. I can change the fucking camera that's being used, my front camera or my back camera. Like I can just basically control all of it from my computer, which is pretty fucking neat. I can set it up to detect motion sensors, motion detection, or audio detection. What software did I need to set up the camera? The only thing I downloaded on my phone was, it's called IP Webcam Pro. That was the only thing I downloaded. It was just an app I downloaded on my phone. That was it. It's got a lot. It's got a lot of options. It's neat. So, oops. I don't know. Is it still working or no? Okay. The government can now see me. Maybe. No? Wouldn't put it past them. So this is rendered like through the web browser, and now I'm rendering it through JavaScript. I can have two-way audio on it too, which is pretty fucking cool. So like I can just set it up somewhere and have it like detect motion, and then if someone's on it, I could just talk into my computer and be like, hey, what the fuck? And have it come out my phone, which is pretty fucking cool.